I don't feel like I've heard a lot about Halloween time and fantasy much. Actually, I don't know if I've ever heard of Halloween or any other similar candy giving holiday in a fantasy setting. And so, today we're going to fix that and figure out what would their candy be like and what wouldn't their candy be like. Because even though this is still a fantasy setting, there are still rules that should be followed to create a believable type of candy. So then, the next question, what type of fantasy? Because there's a lot of different types of fantasy, and so I figured I'd try to do one for each. And I've narrowed it down to 7. So like, for example, one candy will be for a more typical naturey grassland type of fantasy, one will be for a more hot volcanic type of place, one will be for a cold and snowy environment, one will be for a more sci-fi futuristic place, one will be for a dystopian city, one for a tropical watery place, and finally, one for a more ethereal type of place. I figured that way you would show off more of the different types of possible candies, rather than them all just being in one type of typical place, like a medieval fantasy. This way I can really show off the different types of candy there could be. But, as usual, before we get into designing the fantasy part, I think it's best to look at how candy evolved in real life. Well, at first, they actually used to give things out other than candy for Halloween, like fruit, nuts, toys, or even just straight up money. It actually wasn't until around World War II that candy actually started to become the norm. Now, the reason for this, as you might imagine, was because handing out something like an old slimy apple that had been sitting in the back of the basement for a few months, or even worse, something that was homemade and really could have anything in it, really wasn't the most safest or hygienic types of things to be giving out. And so, things like wrapped and sealed candies became the average thing to give out, as of course they're a lot easier to keep safe. And also, I guess kids got more picky about being given things like a turnip on Halloween, and so candy and chocolate was chosen. Though, personally, if I was given things like nuts or a dried fruit on Halloween, I wouldn't be complaining. I don't know if I'm just weird about that, but I don't know, I just was never super into candy or chocolate. I can't even remember the last time I actually had chocolate. I just was never super into chocolate and candy, which may be kind of surprising actually, considering how much of it I draw. But honestly, I like looking at it more than eating it. Heck, I even have a bunch of candy I just keep and put out every year for decoration. Anyways, I'm getting distracted. Back to why I brought up the origins of trick-or-treating. Well, I was thinking, how would that work in a fantasy world? Like, I imagine it would eventually evolve into being in some sort of wrapper. I mean, I don't care how much magic you've got. If you're going to be giving out some cookie you made yourself that could really have anything in it, I'd rather not risk it. So, it's safe to say that whatever is being given out for this holiday is going to be wrapped. And then after that, there's the question of what it would actually be. And this is where you have to consider the wealth of the village or town, or forest. I mean, I don't judge. You can give out candy from a tree house if you want to. But the big question is, how wealthy is the local population? Because if they're poor, then they're not going to be able to give out things like chocolate and candy. Also, they probably wouldn't see much value in it either. I don't know if you've ever been starving before, but let me tell you, the longer you go without food, the better it tastes. So like, if I was a kid living in a time with not much money and not much food, I'd probably much rather get a small bag of like rice over a chocolate bar, because you'd value things that fill you up more rather than just something that tastes good. And so, the same thing would apply to a fantasy world, I think. Though, there's something else you have to consider, and it's something that's even more important than whether it's sweet or filling. And that's that it would have to be something that can be gotten enough of. Like, as I said, that's why fruit and nuts worked very well, and were given out a lot, because they're small and you can easily get a bunch of them. But if you're, say, living in a desert, those might not exist there. Which brings me to what I chose for each of my candies. Well, first of all, I imagine the economy in each area is not going to be that bad. I mean, they're not like super wealthy, but they're not poor either. They can package things, but they are still limited to the ingredients that can be scavenged in the local area. And so, as such, I decided for the forest area to go with mushrooms, chocolate mushrooms to be exact. I imagine they might not quite have enough chocolate to be making entire chocolate bars frequently. So, to save a lot on the amount of chocolate they use, they'd only put a little bit on other things, like on top of mushrooms, or maybe even acorns or nuts. This way, it's still close to the typical Halloween candy, while also showing the fantasy side of things. I also played around with the idea of the wrappers being leaves, though I didn't go through with that, I just couldn't get it to look right. But please, if you're thinking of making your own fantasy candy, feel free to use that idea. Heck, feel free to use any idea I ever make. I'm here to give inspiration in any way I can. And as for the second candy, that's the hot one, the deserty one. And for that area, I imagine the local ingredient would be cheese. It would be the most common type of food there, as it would be too hot for any other kind of plant to grow. Also, I don't want to get distracted here, but the cheese may be gotten from caves. Don't think about that. Anyways, the point is that cheese would be the most common type of ingredient there, and so incorporating that into the candy seemed right. And so, the candy for that place is a cheese-filled brownie sort of thing that probably is mostly dirt. This is probably the least edible one for people with normal stomachs. And then for the third one, the snowy cold one. For a place like that, it would need to be something that could be gotten easily, as I said. And since it would be freezingly cold there wouldn't be many plants again. So, probably nothing too fresh. Grains could still work though, as they can last a long time. I also figured maybe like maple syrup could work as an ingredient, since, that can be gotten from trees when it's cold out. And together with all that, the thing I came up with was these syrup biscuits. And don't worry, they're all packaged. And then after that, it's onto the futuristic one. And for this, I decided to go with a chocolate chip. A computer chip, that is. I mean, hey, you've gotta get something for the cyborgs, too. And then onto the next one, it's the dystopian one. I wanted it to be very bland. I mean, it's a dystopian city, it has to be as bland as candy can be while still being candy. And so, the thing I decided to go with was a caramel cube. I felt kind of bad doing it, as I really don't have anything against caramel cubes. They're far from the worst types of candy out there. But a caramel cube was really the only candy I could think of that was perfectly cubey and could be colorless. And so yeah, I don't have much to say about it. I had to kind of purposely turn down my creativity with this one. This is why I don't design dystopian places. I need more creative, colorful things than this. And then there's the Cloud Pop. This one was for the ethereal kind of place. I wanted something that seemed kind of magical and dreamy, but didn't actually have like actual magic to it. Like it could be real. And so I thought something like causing candy shaped like a cloud would work well. This one would probably be safe to eat too, although it probably wouldn't really taste like much. It'd probably just taste like air, honestly. And then finally there's the ocean one. And it's sand. It's just sand. Don't eat it. It's literally just sand. I don't have anything else to say about it. Anyways, that's gonna do it for all the candies. I actually got a lot more ideas while making these, and I'll probably have to do something like this again next year. Like, I thought there could just as easily be some sort of syrup candy for the cold place, or even like a syrup icicle, or heck, even like syrup flavored snow. That's a real thing people do too. They put syrup on snow as a candy. Or like with the seaside place, I went with sand, but I also got a lot of ideas for some sort of like sushi candy or fish candy. They'd all probably be absolutely disgusting, but still, there's a lot of ideas there. And then of course with like the nature one, There's so many ideas for different types of candy nuts or berries or even some sort of like tree bark candy, like some sort of tree that's edible. You take the bark off and, I don't know, put chocolate on it. I don't know, there's a lot of ideas there. So yeah, probably gonna have to do this again next year. Overall, I think these designs turned out fine enough, and they're a good starting point at least. I don't know, I'll be back next year with more, don't worry. Though, as you may have figured out, I really don't recommend eating any of them. I mean, maybe the snow one's probably fine, that's just grains and syrup. But the rest, I don't know, you might want to just skip trick-or-treating in any of these places.